Order, order. Before I call Rachael Maskell to move the motion, it might help colleagues to know that I intend to start the wind-ups at 10:30 at the latest, and there'll be 3 front bench spokesmen. Rachael Maskell to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Bone. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered safety in prisons. I'm grateful for the opportunity to bring forward this important debate today and addressing the growing risks in our prisons with regards to personal safety. My interest in penal matters were instilled in me by my late uncle, Professor Terence Morris, since very early childhood. He was a great penal reformer who played an active role in the Longford Committee advising Prime Minister Harold Wilson on penal reform. He wrote the seminal work Pentonville, a sociological study of an English prison, which transformed the prison service, and was a leading member of the abolition movement over the death penalty. Beyond being an academic in criminology, to me he was my mentor, as he continued until his untimely death 2 years ago. Since I made my maiden speech on the subject of mental health, due to the rising risks seen in my local services, I've also been representing people for the last 5 years working in our high-security psychiatric hospital as Unite's Head of Health, and have campaigned alongside members who have been challenged by the increased risks they've experienced due to skill mix, a rise in pension age, cut to staff members, and threats by other changes to their terms and conditions. And therefore I am well aware of the dangers that staff working in such environments face, both physical and mental. However, today I'll be focusing on Her Majesty's prisons and the risks that are increasing as the environment grows ever more dangerous. The changing demographic of our rising prison population against the backdrop of cuts, in particular escalating the challenges placed upon prison officers and staff today. In bringing today's debate to the fore, I want us to examine why our prisons have become ever more understaffed and overcrowded, resulting in high levels of risk, even violence, to prison staff.
Will my friend give way?
Yes, I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I congratulate her on her election to Parliament and on securing this important first Westminster Hall debate. And she's going to bring huge experience to Parliament in these matters. The government says it's working to provide new prison places, yet today new statistics show there's been an increase in the number of prisoners forced to share cramped accommodation, now over a quarter of all prisoners. Would my honourable friend agree that this can only lead to greater tension in prisons and further put safety at risk?
I thank my honourable friend for bringing that very important point, because overcrowding is impacting on safety in prisons in such a way, and I will go on to set out how that is having an impact, but certainly sharing cells is one of the things that we're facing in our prisons today. I will certainly give way.
I'm very grateful to her. I too congratulate her on securing this important debate. Would she also agree that another aspect which is increasing risk in prisons is the change to some of the conditions, including in relation to earned privileges and the crackdown on Rachael, which means that prisoners themselves are feeling more stressed, and that of course impacts on behaviour and risk?
Again, my honourable friend brings a really good point about the opportunities that prisons have around rehabilitation and being able to have that opportunity to reform their lives. And again, this will be a point I pick up later in the debate. I will give way.
For giving way, can I congratulate her on being elected to Parliament, but more importantly, this adjournment debate today. Would you not agree with me that in 2013, 45 million was actually spent on redundancy packages, and that the service is now very dangerously low, to say the least, about that? Could you comment on that probably later in her speech?
I thank my honourable friend for bringing this really important point. The reduction in prison officer numbers is having such a serious impact on the safety in prisons. And again, that's a subject that I will want to return to, because it is a major theme of why prisons are so unsafe today. But I will make some progress now. And one of the things that I do want us to really consider is why Labour's 1997 ambition on not just being tough on crime, but also the causes of crime is rapidly fading in the ideological drive to cut public services. And also how underinvestment and resolution is required in order to bring urgent investment and resolution is required to bring an end to these unnecessary trends. Our prison infrastructure, as with all public services, has shifted towards the private sector, which results in a fragmented landscape through which to steer change and forever draws resource from the service into the market. This has particularly failed where private companies have bid for and won loss-leading contracts, resulting in severe cuts to staffing. The Sodexo contract with Her Majesty's Prison in Northumberland would be one such example, where a staggering 50% to staffing cuts has had a profound effect. We've also witnessed the closure of 18 prisons since 2010, many of them smaller prisons, including some high-performing centres, despite the evidence which demonstrates that smaller prisons correlate to safer environments. New prisons have also emerged, and of course we now see the building of the Titan prison in Wrexham, which is to home 2,000 prisoners, ignoring the research on size of prison and the safety related to that. Putting this evidence aside, the issue of overcrowding across the prison estate is now at crisis point, and we must seek urgent redress. It is reported that 80 out of 118 prisons are now categorised as overcrowded. In 2014, for example, Wandsworth Prison was running at 177% capacity, nearly double it was designed for. Other full prisons are being ordered to make emergency space for prisoners. And therefore, as the point made earlier, prisoners are doubling up in cells which are designed for one person, in some cases 3 prisoners sharing just one cell. So the number of prisoners we've now got living in overcrowded accommodation tops 20,672 and growing, over a quarter of the prison population. This is clearly putting a serious strain, on our prison infrastructure and facilities. Only half of prisons inspected now are achieving reasonably good or good standards. I will certainly give way.
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way and also add my congratulations on securing today's important debate. And I think, as she knows, I've got 2 prisons, a privately run prison and still what we call a government-run prison in my constituency. And she may well be aware of a death in custody of one prisoner in HMP Old Course. Would she agree with me that serious incidents to staff or to inmates should be reported to the local constituency MP so that he or her can assure their constituents of the safety and the issues surrounding any serious incidents in any prison in their area?
I thank my honourable friend for raising this really tragic situation, and of course reports should come to members of Parliament because it's important that we scrutinise the environments that we are responsible for overseeing in our communities, but also being able to raise important matters to really drill down why these incidents are occurring in our prisons, to get some real answers. So I think that's a very important point that has been made. One of the things we are noticing with the increased number of people put into our prisons, the overcrowding, is that there is now a real exacerbation in violent tendencies. Overcrowding now being cited as one of the major risk factors for people working in prisons, and therefore not just for those staff, but also a risk factor to other prisoners. But it is this toxic mix of overcrowding combined with financial and staff cuts that is at the centre of the penal system that is failing those who find themselves incarcerated, not to mention the longer-term impact on the public and wider society. Over the last 2 decades, the prison population has nearly doubled to 84,485. The number of women in prison has also doubled. Since 2010, staffing has been cut by 28%, or a staggering 12,530 personnel. Over the last 3 years, we've seen resources cut by 263 million. It's not just Her Majesty's opposition that has observed the impact of this, but also the Chief Inspector of Prisons, Nick Hardwick, who considered this to be extremely serious and caused him high levels of concern. He said the system was not coping and warned that because of staff shortages, men were locked up together for 23 hours a day, causing huge tensions. He also highlighted how extra resources were needed or the prison population had to be reduced. This is a political and policy failure, he said. This is not the fault of staff. The demands on the system have completely outstripped the resource available to them. In the Chief Inspector of Prisons annual report at the end of last year, the significant decline in safety was highlighted, and the durability of the impact of the time spent in custody was highlighted. The average sentence has now risen to 15.5 months, or for those on mandatory life sentences, up to 17 years. Punitive incarceration, which is all that can be achieved through long periods of detention without opportunity for rehabilitation, restoration, and the development of skills, worth and value, does not break the crime cycle. And this is now evidenced by the extremely high, although now fairly static, reoffending rates, thus putting the public at further risk. Only the last government had to take a U-turn on banning guitars in prison and other forms of basic functions, like being able to take a shower or phone calls. This, of course, dehumanising prisoners, which has its consequences. Within prison, minimal time out of a cell does not provide sufficient release for prisoners and instead contributes to the escalation of risk, whether violent or otherwise. Physical, sexual and verbal assault rates remain unacceptably high, and we have seen an increase in violent incidents in prisons. The number of serious assaults last year rising by a third. The National Tactical Response Group, which deals with the serious incidents and riots in prison, has seen an 89% increase in demand since 2010, with 223 calls in 2014, compared with 129 calls 2 years earlier. And only this week we have witnessed a riot at Her Majesty's Prison Stockton, involving 60 prisoners and hospitalising an officer who was stabbed. The Prison Officers Association states that prisons throughout the land are on the brink of such incidents occurring due to the dangerous staffing levels and the challenges brought by overcrowding. Substance abuse, the sharp rise in availability of legal highs, and alcohol abuse is also challenging the safety in prisons and is now at a serious level in a third of prisons. And the marked prevalence of this can particularly be found amongst women prisoners, and this is leading to negative behaviours and creating risks. I want to dwell a little more on staffing numbers, if I may. Despite the numbers of those held in custody rising, staffing levels have fallen dramatically. This has not only put a tremendous strain on remaining staff, but has led to unsafe skill mix. We are now seeing staff who are without sufficient competencies being required to take on responsibilities beyond their scope. This is not only a failure of the prison management's duty of care to the members of staff, but also impacts on safety standards and increasing risk to staff. The lack of staffing and changes in skill mix is having a direct correlation with the number of violent incidences we are witnessing in our prisons. Let me set these out for you. From 2013 to 2014, assaults between prisoners rose by 14% and have reached the highest level ever recorded. Serious assaults on inmates has risen dramatically by 38%. In 2013, there were 11,397 assaults on prisoners. 2014, 16,196. In 2013, there were 1,588 serious assaults, with 2,145 serious assaults in 2014, a third increase. There were 4 homicides in 2013. And 41% of prisoners now feel unsafe in their environment. Incidents against staff rose by a third, including the highest ever level of serious assault. And staff now have an unacceptable level of sickness, averaging 10.8 days, compared to the national average of 4.4 days. But these aren't statistics. These are lives being put in danger. These are prisoners being put at risk, but staff going to work, carrying out their duty day by day, being put at risk, and we must never forget that. Risk to prisoners through incidents of suicide and self-harm is also at an alarming high. Over the last year, we have seen the suicide rate rise by 69%. 8 of these suicides were carried out by prisoners placed in segregation, 4 of whom were known to be at risk. The rate has risen significantly for the first time in 5 years. In prison, the risk of suicide is substantially higher than the rest of the population at 6%, with 21% risk for men and 46% risk for women. A staggering 23,478 prisoners self-harmed last year. The time officers can invest in building relationships is now depleted, and there isn't that time to sit down, have the conversation, the cup of tea, and to talk through the stresses and strains placed on prisoners. So instead, prisoners are turning on themselves in desperation. The challenges are also facing our youth justice system too, and due to the shortage of appropriate placements, young offenders are often placed in these dangerous environments. I certainly will give way.
Just before she, thanks to my honourable friend for giving way. Just before she moves off the point, there's a minister here, and the government know these statistics that my honourable friend is quoting to them, and it's the government who have to provide a safe working environment for staff. Does she believe that they are failing in their duty of care?
I thank my honourable friend for raising this issue. Clearly, staff working in prisons, the prison officers and other staff are being failed. It's not acceptable that people are put at risk day by day in turning up in their duty to serve, and therefore I call for urgent attention to be brought to this and resolution to be brought. It's not acceptable just to read and listen to statistics. We have to take action. You see, with the right facilities, the right staffing levels, the right support and the right approach, much of this can be avoided. The impact of the cuts to our public services has also led to this perfect storm, failing people who then end up in a life of crime. We have no less than a moral duty to properly resource our services now, to ensure that the prison population is full in the future. It is societal and government failure which has led to too many challenged individuals ending up in a life of crime. And I just want to have a little look at who are behind the bars, because we have to look at what's happening in the wider society of why people are ending up in prisons. 39% of our prison population experienced neglect or abuse as a child. 3/4 had an absent father, a third an absent mother. A third of looked after boys and nearly 2/3 of looked after girls end up in crime, something that I hope is picked up in the Education and Adoption Bill. Half of women have experienced domestic violence, a third sexual abuse. 66% of women and 38% of men committed offences to buy drugs. Half of all violent crime were by offenders under the influence of alcohol. 49% have anxiety and depression, and 25% of women suffer from psychosis. 20 to 30% of people have learning difficulties, and 47% have no qualification. This emphasised society's failure, government's failure in putting in the steps and the measures early on, making those interventions which can turn the life course of those individuals around. These people shouldn't be in our prisons, but we have got serious questions to ask. Because it is a shameful story that the state hasn't intervened and given these people the hope and the opportunity that many of us have had. And therefore, it's this fate that they have ended up in prison that must be addressed. I call this a crime of the state in not providing the right support at the right time. And that's why today's debate is so crucial. Because if we don't change the course of these people's lives up and down the country, the prison population can only rise. So my question for the Minister is this. Is his government really going to stop and appraise the next wave of £30 billion cuts and address the root causes of why our prisons have become overcrowded and unsafe? My second challenge for you is to ask you to resolve the issue around reoffending rates. Such a punitive penal system as we have now, ever stripped of rehabilitation and resettlement opportunities, resulting in increased uncertainty and diminished hope for prisoners, is resulting in a reoffending rate as high as 45.2% within a year, and for children, 68.2%. When the evidence is here, I will certainly give way to my honourable friend.
I congratulate her on securing this debate. She touches again for the second time, I think, in her contribution on the issue of reoffending rates. Does she agree with me that that is a fundamental part of what the government need to do to fundamentally address the high issue of reoffending, and that is why some of the many profound problems that she has outlined continue to prevail in our prisons.
I thank my honourable friend for making this really important point, because we've got this revolving door of people leaving prison and not having the support and rehabilitation and then ending up back in the criminal justice system. And that is a failure. It's a failure of our finances, of how we are investing in these lives, but it's a failure of those individuals who are then marked with a life of crime ahead of them. And therefore, I want to pick up on that point, really, and to lead on to say that too many people are leaving prison without the support they need. They don't get the support when incarcerated, but on leaving prison, they're also not getting the support. 50,000 prisoners released didn't get any support and post-release supervision last year. In my constituency, I heard from a woman who had left prison with no discharge support to end up on the streets, exposed to exactly the same risks that she had before being placed in jail, but being fortunately picked up by the voluntary sector, being able to address some of those issues, but seriously under-resourced voluntary sector that could only make a little step in making her life a bit different.
Will friend give way?
I will certainly give way.
Yeah, the previous Secretary of State for Justice actually talked about rehabilitation revolution. But some of that, some basic things need to happen there, don't they? Things like education and basic literacy and numeracy, and then, of course, supported training if people are going to be prepared for a better life outside prison. Would my honourable friend agree?
I thank my honourable friend for raising this point, because we are not seeing any revolution in rehabilitation. We are seeing prisoners who are locked up in their cells for 23 hours a day, not able to have the chances in life, not be able to have the investment that they need. And the reduction in prison officers is such that they have no other opportunities until they reach the door of prison to do anything alternative. And of course, where people are returning to is the life they knew before. They haven't had the turnaround that they desperately need and the support that will change the course of their life. So we need to address not just this revolving door, but the overcrowding situation, because the reality is, as people come back into the penal system, then we are building on that overcrowding crisis that we have. And therefore, we need to address that, but also to look at our probation service, which again has experienced severe cuts at this time, as it has been taken on its own journey around privatisation and being taken out into the market, and obviously not being able to integrate fully with the rest of the criminal justice system. And we have got to ask serious questions on that. I will certainly give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate her on securing this important debate. Just to observe that the probation service isn't just fractured from the rest of the criminal justice system, it's actually fractured from itself, in that there's been an unnecessary, pointless, destructive, quite dangerous separation within the probation service itself.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for making that point. I was talking to the prison officers, NAPO, the trade union representing probation officers only yesterday, who were talking about further cuts that are going to be made to the service at a time where today's debate we are hearing that really we need investment rather than cuts, so we aren't able to break that cycle. But the reorganisation, another reorganisation which really has no purpose and point in really feeding into that bigger picture we have seen with the probation service. I will certainly give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. And whilst we understand that there is overcrowding within our prisons, does she not agree that a lot of the responsibility for the running of the prisons has to be at the top? It has to be from the governor down and from the management of it. And the honourable member has just mentioned some investment into a number of the prisons. In Northern Ireland, it'll be slightly different, it's political, but £10 million has been spent on Maghaberry prison over the past 4 years because prisoners have damaged it. So, and there has been some infrastructure work done, but surely it starts with the management of the prison as well.
I thank my honourable friend for that point. This is a real issue about leadership within the prison sector. I wouldn't say just management, but really providing the leadership over the whole prison service. And that's why government has got an important point, but also leaders in prisons, whether they're directors or governors, really have got that important role. And what we're seeing is such a churn in the number of governors that they're only in post for about 3.5 years before they move on, that they actually don't build those relationships with the organisations they've got responsibility for, and therefore that does have a really serious impact on providing the leadership for the whole organisation to follow. So thank you very much for raising that point. The third big question I have got is around the issue of why so many people are ending up in our prisons in the first place. We know that the number of community orders has fallen despite their effectiveness. We know that so many people end up in prisons being held awaiting trial, 27% not then returning to prison afterwards, and therefore people being brought into our prison services to experience other sentencing afterwards. And then also, I want to challenge the way that we are incarcerating so many people who themselves are experiencing mental health challenges or addiction from substance abuse, and whether to question that is the right environment for people then to be locked up for 23 hours a day when they're struggling with their own health issues, and if not, we can find alternative environments which will really help address the health issues as well as address the issues around re-offending. But I do want to now make a little bit more progress to talk about staff safety, because there is this clear correlation between safe staffing levels and the safety levels of prison. And this is most evident with this 28% cut in the number of prison staff. The ratio now between prisoner and prison officer is 1 to 4.8, whereas in 2000 it was 1 to 2.9. So we are seeing prison officers carrying so much more responsibility, and therefore the effectiveness of their interventions obviously diluted. But also staff themselves are now enduring an unacceptable level of assaults. All assaults, I must say, are unacceptable. But in 2014, 3,637 assaults, 477 of which were serious, were experienced by prison staff. That's a third increase. 10,000 working days were lost due to absence, mainly for physical reasons, but also increasingly because of work-related stress. Isn't that the worst environment you can imagine, where you fear risk to your life on a day-by-day basis as you go to work? 10,000 days lost. That in itself could be seen by an increased number of prison officers there making the workplace more safe, but also we need to think of the real cost of that. And staff have been challenged by, of course, the higher levels of violence in their workplace. Prison officers having to face risk that very few in our population can even begin to understand. And as the prison population becomes more violent, and it is becoming more environment, it's becoming more dangerous. Violent incidents rising from 32 a day to 42 a day, 8 of which are to members of staff. In 2012, there were 213 hospital attendances, compared to 170 in just the first 2 quarters of 2013. These are officers who are experiencing injuries at such a level that it takes them into our emergency services. I will certainly give way.
And the honourable member mentions the commitment and sacrifice of prison officers. I would like to put on record the assassination of prison officer David Black in my constituency on his road to McGabry Prison by Republicans. And I think we have something like 51 or 61 prison officers in Northern Ireland that have been murdered over the past number of years, and they've paid the supreme sacrifice and all of that.
I thank my honourable friend for drawing attention to this really tragic situation where the lives of prison officers are being put at such high risk that many do not return to their families at the end of their working day. That is clearly unacceptable, and early intervention to make sure that people have a safe passage to work and from work, as well as in the work environment, is absolutely crucial for our public servants. And of course, we know the reward is not great for our prison staff. We're seeing them stretched with their cover. We're seeing work intensification. them really challenged with dealing with the emotional demands of the work, because they themselves have got an ambition for those that they serve, but they're not able to fulfil that ambition because of such are the pressures put on them. And also, we're hearing from the Prison Officers Association that there is a lack of support from management coming down, high levels of bullying in already a very tense and violent environment. We've seen cuts to pay in real terms and cuts to pensions, and of course, a real fall in morale. The report into health and safety shows that 30% of officers have been physically assaulted within the last 4 years, and many more experience psychological distress or emotional exhaustion. And of course, we know there are real challenges now to recruitment and retention levels amongst prison staff, and how we can see that can come about with such an environment as I've described today. And of course, prison governors aren't there for long enough to provide the stability that staff need to build those relationships of trust in order to give that prison a real vision and a sense and purpose of direction before they're moved on to somebody else. So Labour are today calling for some clear measures to be taken, starting with leadership, as we have discussed. We need governors to be established in prisons for longer, to bring stability and leadership necessary to make sure the reforms can take place to make prisons safer. We also need, and we believe in Labour, to accompany this with better governance by prison boards, which are routing jails in the local communities, with representatives from councils, charities, the probation service, the police and other organisations to provide opportunity to build the bridge back into community living again, which is so important for the future of the lives of these prisoners. We need to refresh the prison inspectorate so Her Majesty's inspectors are truly independent of political interference, but also publish their action plans and demands for the resourcing that is necessary, and that the support of their actions does follow, so that we don't just have action plans, but we actually can see the result of that coming to fruition and then scrutinise the process behind that. Above all, we need to ensure that the prisons stop fueling crime but break the cycle of crime. This will only be achieved by properly resourcing early intervention measures to prevent people falling into crime in the first place. But for those who do fall through the net, evidence-based rehabilitation programmes that focus on developing education, training and skills, improving health, well-being and self-worth, and reorientating prisoners to life after prison, where they will not be exposed to the same risks they faced before their convictions. This will only be achieved by sourcing prisons with the best facilities and adequate staffing levels to facilitate such transformation. Such a programme will secure staff and prisoner safety and will cut spending on the prison service for the longer term. So to conclude, we come into politics not just to talk about issues or ideas, but to exercise every moment to bring transformative change to the lives we are sent here to represent. Minister, our prisons are in a very dangerous situation. I ask, are you willing to challenge the system and ensure that the service is made safe and effective? I thank you, Mr Bone, for allowing me this time today.
It might be helpful to members to know that 5 members are seeking to catch my eye from the back benches, and we've got just over 25 minutes until the wind-ups. And I should have reminded the Minister that the proposer will get 2 minutes at the end to Jim Channon.
It's a pleasure to come and speak in this matter, and can also congratulate the Honourable Lady for York Central and outlining very well the issue of safety and security is not one that is limited to England and Wales, and I want to give, if I can, perhaps a Northern Ireland perspective to it, and then refer to the House of Commons committee report as well, if I can, in the short time I have available. The issues for us in Northern Ireland are no different from those in the mainland. Prison guards feel they have no ability to restrain or confront dangerous inmates who damage televisions, wantonly break and vandalise equipment that they know will have to be replaced. And my honourable friend who's just leaving the chamber from Upper Bann and his intervention referred to the £10 million that has been spent in repairs and on infrastructure as well. Some of the inmates, they think that there's a sense of, well, they can't do anything to me, and there are no consequences to actions. So those issues are in England and Wales are very pertinent as well to Northern Ireland. I spoke to the Minister before the debate to make him aware of some of the issues I want to refer to. I also want to refer to the availability of drugs in prisons. I'm not sure if it's been touched upon or will be touched upon. I know I spoke to the Minister beforehand in relation to it. But there's something seriously wrong with the availability of people who go to prison who aren't addicted, but come out of prison addicted. How can that be? In Northern Ireland, I've read some correspondence with the Department of Justice and the Minister in particular, and there are scanners being introduced in prisons, but at this moment in time, they sit with dust gathering on them in offices and not used. And I understand that my information goes back to tell me that that's because they don't want to offend some of the people coming into prison who are smuggling the drugs in. There has to be a method of change which has to start at the very top from the governors as well. Last week I spoke in an intervention in the adjournment debate on lenient sentences, and I just want to say sometimes that there is a problem when stronger sentences aren't handed down for the crimes that are committed. And let's be quite clear that people are in prison for a purpose. They have done something wrong. The law of the land has laid that down. But we do want to make sure there's funding available to adequately staff the prisons. A very vicious circle. We need more officers to staff the inmates and keep things under control. We also need a legal system that adequately reflects the seriousness of the issue. I'm not in any way asking for a call back to the days when prisoners were kept in a cell day and night. We should and we need to rehabilitate prisoners, giving them skills to turn their lives around in the outside world. But this cannot be done by fostering a gang mentality, which some constituents have. And I could refer to one incident which some of my constituents told me about last week, and it refers to Montgomery Prison, where the dissident Republicans, they're able to go out and have their time and physical exercise and enjoy the sun, which we don't get very often in Northern Ireland, I understand. But the Protestants and the Loyalists in the other section are in 23-hour lockdown. I mean, again, it's not your responsibility, Minister, but I want to have it on the record here because it's an issue that I'm concerned about. It's an issue that's been brought to my attention just in the last week. So there has to be an honesty when it comes to the prison system. I have known some men who had a time in prison due to the troubles, came out changed men who own their businesses and take care of their families and have become upstanding members of the community. So prison can change if it's done correctly inside, as the Honourable Lady has said in her introduction. I think it's important that we do rehabilitate and skill and give people a different focus and a different direction whenever they get back out again. I also want to make a comment, if I could, very quickly on family visits. Accessibility to prisons is so important for families who are unable to travel, perhaps as much as they'd like to. The reading of the House of Commons Justice Committee report made it only right and proper that the committee should express grave concern over the increases in assaults, and the Honourable Lady had referred to that. And we also can't ignore the issues of self-harm and suicide in inmates. And I've just reading in the background notes, and I could just for the record to quote this if I could, Mr. Bowen. One lady referred to her son who was a suicide victim. The prison service has our loved ones and they don't know often how to cope with them. They're not trained properly to deal with mental health, and they haven't sometimes the staff to cope as well. So those are issues that we have to look upon. And as that lady also said, or another lady said, I don't expect the prison officers to love my son, but I did think they would look after him until he came home to get that proper treatment. These are the issues which cannot be ignored, because there are occasions when it does happen. And we have to address the issue of assaults. And the evidence report said the evidence gathered by the HM Inspectorate of Prisons, the government's performance data, it referred all indicated deterioration in standards of safety and performance across the prison estate over the last 2 years. Those issues have to be addressed, not just here in the mainland England and Wales, but also in Northern Ireland as well. And hopefully this debate, and whenever I send the Minister responsible in Northern Ireland just a copy of this Hansard debate and outline the things that we have recognised here, and they're very similar to the mainland, we need to do something. We also need to recruit the extra prison officers, and sometimes we can't ignore the experienced officers who have left. And I'll leave this concluding remark, Mr. Bowen, because I'm conscious of other people to speak as well. And that's it. Experienced officers have the knowledge, have the the qualities of life to know how to deal with things. New officers coming in have to learn how that works, and sometimes maybe more should be done to try and keep our experienced officers and ensure that they can then mentor and bring on the new officers coming in. Again, I congratulate the Honourable Lady on giving us all the chance to speak on this here. A massive issue, one that's very important to me, not only for the prison officers who I represent and for my constituency, but those people who are in prison because of their deeds, but who we hope will come out better people. Thank you.
John MacDonald.
I'll be extremely brief, and I apologise to the Minister. I have to leave because I'm chairing another meeting. I apologise for that. We had a debate 6 months ago now, which we led in the main chamber itself, and that was on a report undertaken by the University of Hertfordshire, a number of specialist psychologists, on the issues of stress at work for prison officers themselves, and the levels of stress at work and, mental health issues, to be frank, was appalling. At that point in time, the Minister did offer a meeting, and we've never been able to take that offer up. And I'd ask again whether we could have that meeting to bring in the experts, so that we can have a proper briefing on the issues that were brought out by that report itself. The issues that came up there have been reflected in my honourable friend's speech, which I thought was excellent exposition of where we're at. I was a member of the Justice Committee that prepared that report, and we demonstrated the chaotic nature of the management of the prison service over the last 5 years. The fact that at one point in time the government laid off 800 officers, then realised that actually there was a critical problem in terms of safety of the officers themselves, the rise in assaults, the suicides, the self-harms, all those problems of security as well. And we had those reports of one individual privatised prison, for example, where the inspector said it was easier to get drugs than it was a bar of soap. We had that chaos displayed, and then the government then realised some of its mistakes and started recruiting again. Interestingly enough, it started recruiting some of those officers it actually sacked only the year before into reserve force to then bring them in. And I think there's been chaos over the last 5 years, and it's reflected today as well in what's happening in the probation service. Serco laying off 600 probation officers. Who's going to supervise those people coming out of prison now? And this split in the service, as my honourable friend has mentioned, between the supposed higher risk prisoners who need supervised and this medium to low level is, as far as we can see, almost counterintuitive. There is a shift between medium risk and high risk on a regular basis, and low risk to medium risk. So what we have now is a situation where people are not safe inside. In addition to that, rehabilitation is not taking place because of overcrowding and lack of staff. And when they come out then, they're supervised in almost chaotic manner because of lack of staff, the breakdown of some of the central service provision that was backing up those staff as well, including the failure of computers yet again. But in addition to that, the private companies themselves now trying to maximise their profits by cutting back on the professional standards as far as we can see. I think we're in crisis again. This is not a party political point. Whoever was in government, I'd be making the same statement if we were having this evidence brought towards us. And the evidence is coming from the frontline staff themselves. They're saying we're not coping, given the levels of staffing that we've got and the pressures that are put upon us. I think the Minister, now that he's back in place, I know he takes a real care in his job, and he responded as effectively as he possibly could within the financial constraints under the last government. I feel now that the Minister needs to take a grip of this and say to the Treasury, we need the resources to staff these prisons, to protect the probation service and enhance the delivery service that we're getting from the new companies that have taken over. Otherwise, I fear there are real risks both within the prisons and also as people come out. And that risk is not just to prison officers and prisoners themselves, but also to the general public.
Carolyn Harris.
My honourable friend for securing this important debate, and I thank the Chairman for his excellent stewardship and for calling me to contribute. In April 2013, a young man from my constituency, and for the purpose of this debate I'll refer to him as John, was sentenced to several years' imprisonment at Long Lartin Prison. By June of that year, he was in excruciating and debilitating back pain. He was unable to move and could not independently use the bathroom or feed himself, and as a result he stopped eating. The pain was reported to the medical staff, and despite instructions from the doctor for blood and urine tests to be taken, neither were. By July, the pain was unbearable, but despite repeated requests for pain relief, pain scoring and examination, none were forthcoming. I'm led to believe that not even basic pain relief such as Panadol and ibuprofen were made available to him. His repeated requests for hospitalisation were met for scepticism for the validity of his illness. It was suggested that the symptoms were only a malingering tactic and indeed a ploy to give him an opportunity to escape. In August of that year, John passed away. A post-mortem discovered a lesion that, if tested, would have shown to be cancerous. At an inquest in January of this year, it was determined that John was let down by the prison system, that life-saving treatment was denied him, and as a result he died a very painful and uncomfortable death. The Ombudsman stated that it was the worst case of medical negligence he had encountered. So where are we now? No action was taken against the prison authorities. No one has been held accountable for this gross negligence, and the family are left in disbelief that this preventable death has occurred. And they believe it's not an isolated case, and that within the prison service, and this may well be due to the severe cuts, that there are very similar cases happening in other prisons. This prisoner's safety was jeopardised in the most fatal of ways, and the consequences are that a 34-year-old young man has died. How can the family of my constituent rest knowing that this man's death was probably preventable? He did not receive the due respect and protection whilst in Her Majesty's custody, and furthermore, he was denied medical care that was his basic right. Colleagues, I ask you to consider the evidence and join me in pressing the Minister to investigate this case, to bring closure to a deeply saddened and angry family of John.
Thank you, Mr Bourne, and can I congratulate my honourable friend for an excellent contribution with regard to this extremely important issue. It's certainly my view that the prison service and the probation service, which has been mentioned by different speakers, are in total and utter chaos at this moment in time. And when you look, we shouldn't be surprised. And I'll be referring to HMP Northumberland. It's a prison, not in my constituency, but certainly in the lovely county in which I live. And I want to give a number of examples from that. But it shouldn't be any surprise that we've got this crisis in the prisons. When we look at the way in which we've sold the prison service off to privatised companies like Sodexo, who are a French catering company after all, running prisons in places like Northumberland, my constituency, it doesn't really instill a lot of confidence in the public that we've got this type of organisation running prisons. When Sodexo took over Northumberland, HMP Northumberland, they immediately made 1/3 of the staff redundant. And what happened? The prison was in chaos, and as was mentioned by my honourable friend before, they then had to get a bank of people that had just made redundant to make themselves available, and that still is the case. And there's been horrific situations occurring at HMP Northumberland. We're looking at whose safety. It's not just the safety of the staff. And at this time, I've got to put on record the fantastic job the prison officers do with regards to the work in the prisons, under tremendous pressure, and the stress-related illness within the Prison Officers Association, within the prison officers themselves, is just beyond all imagination. The issues raised again by my honourable friend, the member for York Central. But we look at what's happened because of the staff reductions. There's been 1/3 of the staff across the country made redundant. In some prisons, the prison staff's being reduced by 50%. Are we surprised that there's problems in the prisons? Are we surprised that there's been an increase in the assaults of around about 10%? That's on the prisoners. Are we surprised that there's been an increase on assaults to staff of 11%? And are we surprised that serious offences on the prisoners is 35%, and an increase of serious offences on staff last year was an increase of 33%? Of course we shouldn't be surprised when there isn't anybody there managing the prisons the way that there should be. And I mentioned before the fact that we've got a lot of people now on bank working if and when they're needed, and we've lost a lot of experience within the prison service. But when we look at my personal situation with HMP Northumberland, Mr. Bourne, the HMP Inspector of Prisons, Neil Hardwick, said only on this year, 27th of January, with regard to HMP Northumberland, it was a damning report. He said not all prisoners received a thorough initial risk assessment or induction. Prisoners said they felt less safe at Northumberland than at comparable prisons. Record assaults were high and work to confront bullying and violence lacked rigour. There had been 3 self-inflicted deaths since 2012, and although a prisoner had been... Listen, this list could go on, and I understand by the way you are looking at me, Mr. Bourne, there are other speakers. That list gives a clear position of what's wrong with the situation and why there's a crisis in Her Majesty's prisons. My honourable friend mentioned Sodexo, a French catering company running HMP Northumberland. I've had members of the Prison Officers Association coming to see me explaining what's happening inside the prison. If anybody in here likes porridge, let me tell you, porridge, being a comical issue, one of my favourites certainly, if you look at what they're saying, it's very much run on the basis of that fantastic comedy, and that's frightening. I've had sex offenders come to see me who've been put in the wings, normally open wings. Their lives have been threatened, and I've had prisoners come to see us. So it's across the board. I've also had lecturers and civil servants who work in there come to see us, afraid of the situation in the prisons. It's absolutely unacceptable. There's lots and lots of figures which have been mentioned by my good colleagues around the room. I would love to mention lots more. But how can you be in a prison and have a mobile phone? How can you be in a prison and readily get alcohol? How can you be in prison and get drugs if and when you want it? Easier than you can purchase some soap or some toothpaste. It's just totally unacceptable, and it shouldn't be the case, Mr. Bourne. In concluding, the issue with reoffending, of course, we've got the privatisation of the probation service, which is an utter chaos to say that the very, very least. And in Northumberland, we've got Sodexo running the probation service and the prison. So it doesn't really matter whether they get rehabilitated in prison or Sodexo fail to rehabilitate them under the probation service. It's a merry-go-round of finance. And this company can make a fortune for doing absolutely nothing. They can make a fortune for failure, which has got to be a conflict of interest. And I would ask a minister even just to have a look at that conflict. But with a rising population, an increase in overcrowding, violence and reoffending increases, it's of major importance that we get this right.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Bone. And it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Wansbeck. He's brought a certain level of passion, as he does to every issue in this House as well. I'd also like to congratulate my honourable friend for, I think, a distinct and very analytical speech on safety in prisons, and I think it's very important that we bring this issue to the fore. I think, Mr. Bone, if we talk about safety in prisons, the number one issue for me, as when I served on the Justice Committee, is mental health in prisons and the way it is not being treated, I believe, properly. Very often, I'll say something controversial. I do not believe there is anything such as an alcoholic or a drug addict, and I speak as the son of an alcoholic. There is, however, an underlying mental health issue which is not being treated. The figures speak for themselves. In 2013 to 14, an average of 19,383 prisoners were held in overcrowded accommodation, accounting for 23% of the total prison population. What happens with those prisoners with mental health problems? In 2013, 25% of women and 15% of men in prison reported symptoms indicative of psychosis, which is in stark contrast to the general public, which stands at 4%. 26% of women and 16% of men said they had received treatment for a mental health problem in the year before custody. With this knowledge, prisons should do more to ensure that those prisoners with mental health problems receive the appropriate support. Personality disorders are particularly prevalent among people in prison. 62% of male and 57% of female sentenced prisoners have a personality disorder. Can we imagine how that would affect someone serving a sentence and their life afterwards? And if I want to turn, Mr Bone, if you allow me, to someone's life afterwards. Sadly, in my own constituency last November, the issue of the failure to address mental health issues both in prison and upon release came home to me and to the small, tight-knit community of Argoed. Cerys Yem was a young girl. She was on a night out when she met Matthew Williams, as we know. She was brutally murdered at the Sahawi Arms. He himself was to die after being tasered by the police. Mr. Williams was said to have all the symptoms of being a paranoid schizophrenic. He'd been sent to the Sahawi Arms by Caerphilly Council, having just been released from prison. He was not properly monitored following his release, and even though he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia from an early age and was a habitual criminal. His mother told the press at the time he was unable to access the medication upon his release. At the time, she said he should have been in hospital. Every time he came out of prison, we'd go through the same process over and over again. He would be placed in a hostel somewhere with very little supervision and no psychiatric help. Even though a serious case review is ongoing, I asked the then Justice Secretary to launch an urgent review to monitor mental health in prisons. I will be speaking to his successor and will be seeking a meeting where we can talk about mental health and the rehousing of prisoners. Last night, a BBC Wales programme, week in, week out, revealed 2 men who went on to kill and several sex offenders were sent to the B&B upon their release without the knowledge of their landlady. Now, this is banned in England, as is sending 15 and 16-year-olds to B&Bs, yet it is still prevalent in Wales. And I call on the Welsh Government, even though this issue is not devolved, to make sure this practice is stamped out by its council. By its councils. In 2009, and I see the time, Mr. Bones, so I'll try and wind up. In 2009, Lord Bradley, a former Minister of State at the Home Office, called for adequate community alternatives to prisons for vulnerable offenders where appropriate. The report recommended the Department of Health introduce a new 14-day maximum wait to transfer prisoners with acute, severe mental illness to appropriate health setting. There has been progress to access to healthcare for prisoners requiring special treatment. However, the 14-day target has not been implemented and reform continues to be vital. For communities like Argoed, and if the Minister ever wants to visit a community which really is where everybody knows everybody, this is absolutely vital. Now, the family of Miss Yem have called for the Sahawi Arms to be demolished, so it doesn't become a monument to ghouls as 10 Rillington Places or 10 Cromwell Street in Gloucester. I support the family, but I think, really, in the short space of time I have, I would hope that the government would listen to the Prison and Probation Ombudsman for England and Wales, Nigel Newcomen, who said that certain lessons need to be learned. Staff working in prisons, reception should actively identify those with known risk factors such as suicide and self-harm. Violent offences against family members are known risk factors for suicide, and being subject to restraining order can be a sign of increased vulnerability. All new arrivals should promptly receive an induction to provide information to help them with their basic needs in prison. Mental health referrals should be made and acted upon promptly, and there should be a continuity care from the community. And prisoners are most at risk at the first month. But also, even though somebody has served the sentence, they should be monitored if they are found out to have a mental health issue. I urge the Minister, on behalf of the people of the community of Argoed, that action is taken and that we can meet at the earliest opportunity to discuss this issue. Thank you.
Anna Cherry.
Bone, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to have the opportunity to speak in this very important debate on behalf of the Scottish National Party. I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for York Central on securing this debate in this very important issue, and to thank her for her very thoughtful and erudite contribution. She clearly brings very significant relevant experience to this debate, and we should all be very appreciative of that. I note that she asked the question of why prisons in England and Wales are so understaffed and overcrowded, and she answered that by saying it's really part of the ideological drive to cut public services and to shift to private sector provision. and I would wish to associate myself with that conclusion. The Honourable Lady identified various problems in the prison service, how overcrowding exacerbates the risk of violence to staff and other prisoners. The increase in prison numbers, particularly the doubling in the number of women in prison, and the fall in staffing levels, which self-evidently brings about problems. She also mentioned the risk of suicide and self-harm and noted that it was at an alarming high, particularly amongst female offenders. She concluded that we have a moral duty to properly resource addressing these issues, and again I would wish to associate myself with that view, and her call upon the Minister to stop and think before the next round of cuts. Clearly, these matters are devolved in Scotland, and I want to say just a little bit in a moment about how we have tried to address some of these issues. The Honourable Member for Strangford raised particular issues about problems in the Northern Ireland prison sector, and clearly they have particular issues to address there because of the history of the province. And he also raised the issue of availability in drugs in prison, which other members have touched upon, and clearly that is a problem across the prison service in the United Kingdom. The Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington described a situation of chaos in the prison system of England and Wales, and clearly that is deeply concerning. The Honourable Member for Swansea East told us of a very tragic story affecting a constituent of hers whose physical health was not, it seems, addressed at all, leading to his premature death. And the Honourable Member for Islin spoke of the very unpleasant and tragic case which we've all read about, and I think it does highlight the issue of addressing mental health of prisoners and addressing the mental health of those we're trying to rehabilitate in the community. And again, the Honourable Member for Wansbeck raised issues of concern about privatisation. Clearly, Mr Chairman, safety of prison staff and inmates is a matter of grave concern. And we owe a duty of care to people in our prisons, particularly those who are vulnerable. And I would identify vulnerability particularly through mental health issues and also vulnerability of female offenders. I've got a particular interest in this area because in my previous career at the bar in Scotland, I worked for many years as a High Court prosecutor. So I was putting people behind bars. And I have regret to say that the very first woman I ever put behind bars went on to commit suicide in a Scottish prison. And clearly that is not my fault, but it's always weighed heavily on my conscience because I felt this young woman was someone who was in need of assistance that perhaps she didn't get in the prison service. But we are taking steps to address that in Scotland. I've also worked in the past as independent counsel for the families of people who've taken their own life in prison. And I'd like to say something in particular about how we have tried in Scotland to address the issue of suicide in prisons and female offending. Not because I want to say we do things necessarily better in Scotland or score any points. I simply want to give an example of how we're taking things forward, and perhaps the other prison systems in the United Kingdom could draw upon it. In relation to the issue of suicide and self-harm in Scotland, the Scottish Prison Service have something which I believe is replicated in the English Prison Service called the Act to Care model. And it's a model which tries to work in a collaborative way with all prison staff, so that the prison officers, the health care staff, and also family and friends of prisoners to try and identify those at risk and to try and address the risk of suicide and self-harm without putting people in solitary confinement except as an absolute last resort. And I'm pleased to be able to tell you, Mr Chairman, that the rate of self-inflicted deaths in Scottish prisons has reduced in recent years. In the 12 months to the end of March 2014, it was 0.8 deaths per 1,000 prisoners, which is down from 0.9 per 1,000 prisoners in the previous year. Now, that's still not good enough, and we have a long way to go. I believe that the figures in Scotland compare favourably with the rate in England and Wales, which in the year to the end of March 2014 was 1 death per 1,000. But I don't wish to score any point about that. And I recognise, because we have a smaller population in Scotland generally, perhaps it is slightly easier for us to address the risk, the issues of overcrowding in prisons. No account of matters in Scotland would be complete without acknowledging, as I touched upon in my own personal experience of it, that we've historically had a very serious problem with suicide and self-harm amongst female prisoners. And the Scottish Government is keen to try and keep vulnerable groups such as female offenders away from standard prison environments, although clearly the most serious offenders must be in prison for significant periods of time. However, by diverting less serious offenders away from prison, the Scottish Government believes that this can lead to more positive outcomes for offenders' health and well-being. And our Scottish Justice Secretary recently announced a very significant increase in funding of an additional £640,000 for female justice projects as part of what he's described as a radical and ambitious approach to female offending. And the Scottish Government is intending to consult on a plan to provide smaller regional and community-based facilities across the country for female offenders rather than a national women's prison. And it's interesting to note for the record that the Scottish Government was thinking about building a new women's prison but has agreed to reconsider that, amongst other reasons, under pressure from the feminist movement in Scotland, which has been reinvigorated by the independence referendum and also by members of the Scottish Labour Party who raised this issue. The Honourable Labour members will be aware that Kezia Dugdale, the Deputy Scottish Leader, and I've often shared a platform with Kezia Dugdale on feminist issues, and I will look forward to doing so again in the future and wish her well in her bid for the Labour Party leadership. So really, one has to accept that there are certain people who must always go to prison, but I do feel that one contribution that can be made to the debate is keeping female offenders and other vulnerable groups out of prison and in their communities, and rehabilitating them in their communities and addressing the issues which have led them to offend in the first place. And in that way, I hope we can take matters forward. So, Mr Chairman, I'd just like to conclude by again thanking the Honourable Member for York Central for raising this very important issue, and thanking all members for their contribution to the debate. I look forward with interest to hear what the Minister is going to say in due course. Thank you, Mr Chairman.
Thank you, Mr Bone. It is a very great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I approach this debate with a really heavy heart, and the Minister is aware that he is the fourth Prisons Minister that I've had the pleasure of shadowing since being appointed. And these issues have been part of our debates throughout that time. It's never been easy. It's never been a situation where I could arrive at such a debate and say I'm glad that things are improving. But I've never, ever felt so concerned about the situation within the prison system as I do now. And I would like to be able to ask for debates that are more focused on rehabilitation, about dignity for victims, about work in our prisons. Those are the things that we should really be discussing. But instead, we are continually forced by the reality on the ground to concern ourselves with understaffing, with overcrowding, and more with violence. And I know that the Minister cares deeply about this. He often looks at me sort of plaintively, like he does, saying, I care about this too. I know that he cares about this too. I'm pleased that he cares about this too. But surely the number of members who are attending this debate today shows the level of real deep concern across the House, and pleasingly among new members of the House, that they feel moved to come here today to debate those issues with him. And I do hope that he'll be generous in allowing interventions. I do congratulate the new member for York Central on her election, and also for securing today's debate. And it was a real pleasure to listen to her thoughtful opening speech, and I do look forward to working with her on these issues in the months ahead. I know her constituents would be very proud of her speech just now, and I feel her predecessor would have been equally proud to hear what she had to say. The speeches we've heard from honourable members capture the concern that's felt for the state of our prison system. Violent, overcrowded and understaffed prisons do nothing to challenge offending behaviour or to protect victims of crime. And during the debate, we've heard examples of exactly what was achieved by prison policy of the last government. My honourable friend for Streatham and Urmston, no longer here, spoke about Rachael and overcrowding. And she's completely right. She has great experience of serving as a magistrate in Manchester, and she sees frequently the problems upon release and difficulties in securing that important staged release that has been sadly mismanaged too often and now is unavailable to too many inmates. The member for Liverpool Walton spoke about deaths in custody, something which he cares deeply about and sadly is getting more and more experience of having to deal with the relatives who've suffered this tragedy. The member who is sitting next to my honourable friend for Strangford, who sadly I don't know his constituency, thank you, he spoke about governorship. Now, there is clearly a problem with resources in the prison system, but the problems that the Minister is facing are not going to be simply dealt with by increased resources, even should he be able to secure those. Governorship is very, very important. There is too high and frequent a turnover of senior staff in all of our prisons. The average length of tenure is far too short, especially when you compare it to, say, the length of tenure of a leader in an education establishment. That average, I think, is about 9 years. Average in a prison is about 3 years. This has to change. This would not require any additional money to change. The Minister could instigate these kinds of changes very, very quickly. We would like to see boards established that would provide an opportunity for stakeholders across the community and to gather expertise into the running of an establishment. We see that in colleges, we see that in hospitals, we see that in schools. It can be very, very effective. That would completely change the way that an establishment is managed. Prisons should be managed with continuity, with expertise, and they should be inspected rigorously. And I think the government could make some of these changes very, very quickly at no cost, and they would be very, very effective in changing the culture within our jails that we know is so important in preventing violent incidents. The member for Hayes and Harlington, I think, made a very, very good observation about stress at work and the dangerous and monotonous work that prison officers are often faced with undertaking. We would not tolerate these kind of violent incidents should it be nurses or health professionals or teachers being subject to them. And yet often, because it's a prison officer, because these take place in a closed environment, the press don't get so agitated about it. It rarely gets debated properly in prison. Government doesn't feel moved to do very much about it. And I think we need a change of attitude from the Ministry of Justice upon these issues. It is not tolerable that people should be asked to go to work in these circumstances. It's gone on too long. And the Minister's nodding, but this isn't a new thing. This isn't we've not suddenly just noticed this is happening. This is a trend that has been getting worse and worse and worse for now a very long period of time. The member for Wansbeck always speaks with great passion, but he quite rightly identified the problem with probation. This isn't a problem, the chaos and the sort of looming crisis isn't just restricted to the closed prison estate. This is a problem that, because we're not resolving issues inside prison, they are being left to the probation service, which is under increasing strain and has endured a completely needless, distracting reorganisation in the last 2 years and is less and less able to deal with the more difficult problems that it's confronted with. Rehabilitation is not something that is achieved. It's not a light bulb moment. It's not a course and then somebody is somehow mended. That is not what happens. It is day after day after day, challenge and problem of slipping back, of making progress, of slipping back again. And that is something I just don't think we properly appreciate when we say there will be more courses, we will have work in our prisons, this will somehow solve deeply rooted psychological problems. I think we need to get real. And the way that you can help put people back together is by day after day after day having good behaviour modelled by prison officers who are being more and more shut out of the rehabilitation process. They are the people that are there on the wings when someone's visit doesn't take place, where someone's clearly been taking drugs or doing things that they shouldn't do, when they're losing their temper. Prison officers are the people who are there. Yes, we need professionals, we need psychologists, we need social workers, we need educational experts in there too, but it's prison officers. They are the people that are there all of the time, who should be showing how you keep your temper, how you treat people with respect, how you deal with difficult conflicts on the wings without resorting to violence. And they are not able to do it. And they're not able to do it because there just aren't enough of them. And the ones that we have, too often now, are less experienced of prison life than the prisoners they're supposed to be holding. You know, we know this from governors, but we know it too from Nick Hardwick, the excellent Inspector of Prisons. And I think, you know, really, I would urge the Minister to look at these issues with a great deal more urgency than he has to date, and certainly than his predecessors have done. Last week, we saw a report from the Prison and Probation Ombudsman on a rise in deaths of inmates while in segregation units. I know this was deeply shocking to people who work in the system, and I would encourage the Minister to think carefully about how working on a wing where someone has committed suicide, the impact that has on the staff in that unit, and looking at the support that they are able to receive from their employer. I do welcome the government's plans to ban legal highs and to prohibit their production. It's very important, but they are a significant growing problem inside our prisons. They lead to bullying, intimidation and violence, and the Inspectorate is finding more and more that legal highs are a great risk in our prisons. They estimate around a third of prisons in the last year, and they don't show up in mandatory drug testing. They're not being caught in the way they should be due to staff shortages. And I would like the Minister to tell us what they're going to do about legal highs getting inside the prison estate, beyond all the usual stuff that we've all heard before. This is a cultural issue within a prison. It's about having a zero tolerance approach, and he's got to mean it. You know, I've had too many of these debates where the Minister's reassured me on just about everything, and then nothing seems to change. Just on staffing, could the Minister tell us how many prisons are currently reliant on detached duty? You know, these are officers who are going to prisons where they're not familiar with the establishment, they're not familiar with other staff, not familiar with inmates. I think it's a big problem, it's an expensive problem, and something that he does need to turn his mind to very, very quickly. But most importantly, could he tell us what he's going to do to tackle the rising level of violent assaults on prison officers? It's just unacceptable to send public servants into a dangerous workplace day in, day out in fear of their safety. No wonder so many of them are either leaving the service or taking sick leave or becoming ill while at work through stress. But once again, I would like to thank the Honourable Member for York Central for securing this debate so that we can have the chance to put these very serious concerns to the Minister. I congratulate her on securing this opportunity for us. I'm very pleased to see so many honourable and right honourable colleagues here, and I do hope that we've given him enough time. The Minister does need to be able to respond to the questions we've raised and hopefully to take some interventions.
Minister. Thank you very much, Mr Byrne. A pleasure to serve under you as always. And let me begin by warmly congratulating the new member for York Central in what I may say was a very polished opening speech in an adjournment debate. She raised a number of important issues, which I will do my best to try and address in the time that I've got left. She talked about the importance of probation supervision. I would just say to her, with the transforming rehabilitation reforms, one of the things we are now doing is making sure that the under 12-month sentence group now get probation supervision, which they didn't in the past. She talked about mental health issues. I'm sure she will warmly welcome the liaison and diversion services, which are now spreading across the country, something the last government brought in, and we are continuing with. Of course, prevention is better than cure. We would all agree with her on that and want to see less people committing crime and having to go to prison. She did talk about prisoners being locked up 23 hours a day. I would just say to her that only relates to a very small proportion of prisoners in operational emergencies, and even where there are planned restricted regimes, prisoners get considerably more than 1 hour out of their cells. In a second, because I just want to say to both the Honourable Lady for York Central and to the Labour frontbench spokesman that I would just please ask them perhaps to use the term lethal highs when they talk about new psychoactive substances. I think it is a more helpful term, and as we're all committed to trying to get these dreadful things out of our prisons, I think the language actually does matter here, so perhaps we can all agree to call them lethal highs, and of course I give way to her.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. He's quite correct in encouraging us to use the term lethal highs, and I will observe that myself. Just on this issue of work, though, the Minister is fond of saying that there is more work in prisons, and again and again, inspection reports indicate that this is not happening and that prisons overestimate time out of cells and underestimate time in cells. And I think he needs to challenge his officials more on that data, because it seems to be that the prison inspector is encouraging us to question it, and I just want to make sure that he does too.
Minister. Well, I can tell the Honourable Lady she's pushing at an open door as far as the issue of work in prisons is concerned. I mean, the number of hours of work in prisons has gone up. Do I think it's satisfactory? Absolutely not. Of course, I want to increase it much, much more, because prisoners who are gainfully employed, more or less during the hours of the working week that the rest of the population have to work. We know that aids rehabilitation. We know that's going to make them more likely to get employment on release. I want to see that more. I will say more about that if she will bear with me. In terms of reoffending, which was raised, I can say that since 2002, the overall proven reoffending rate has remained stable and currently stands at 26.2%. For adults released from custody, the rate is 45.2%. And has remained relatively stable since 2004. It was slightly higher in 2002 and 2003. Now, in terms of the other speeches, excellent speeches we had, I commend my honourable friend, as I often call him, the member for Strangford, for raising the issue of drugs. I share his horror of drugs in prison. Drugs do destroy lives in the community and in prison, and I will again say more about that in the course of my remarks. The Honourable member for Hayes and Harlington talked about the stress on staff, which I know he cares deeply about, as I do. The Honourable Lady for Swansea East raised a very harrowing individual case, which I didn't have prior warning of, but I can tell her that the Prison and Probation Ombudsman recommendations are being addressed, mostly by the healthcare provider, and that there is an ongoing investigation by the Nursing and Midwifery Council into what happened. And I'm sure she may be aware that healthcare within prisons is provided by the NHS, not actually by the prison service. If she'd like to write to me about that particular issue, I'd be more than happy to receive a letter from her. The Honourable Gentleman for Wansbeck talked about his concerns about Sodexo. I think the parent is a French catering company. He's right. I would just say to him that actually it was another Sodexo prison that won the Elton Prison Industries Award, which his front bench spokesman has just been talking about. And the one I visited in Salford recently, I had actually pretty low levels of sickness absence amongst its staff. The Honourable Gentleman for Isilwyn mentioned quite properly the issue of mental health. He's absolutely right to do so, not least because of the horrific incident which happened in his constituency. And he talked quite properly about the need for suitable accommodation for prisoners on release. And if he wants to correspond with me further on that point, I'd be more than happy to do that with him. The Honourable Lady for Edinburgh West told us about the Scottish prison system. I will make sure that officials within the National Offender Management Service have close contact with the prison service in Scotland. I think we do things very well within NOMS, but I absolutely believe that we can learn lessons from other parts of the world. So I'll make sure that contact happens. The Honourable Lady for Darlington spoke about the importance of the role of the Governor. I agree with her on that. I think it is a leadership issue, as was referred to earlier in the debate. I'll say a bit more about the daily interaction of prison officers, again, which she quite rightly referred to. She specifically asked about longer tenures for governors. I think that is certainly an idea that possibly does have merit, and again, it's something I will look into within the constraints of normal career planning, so we have governors with the right level of experience, particularly to govern some of our larger establishments. But I think she raises a fair point, which I will look into. And again, one honourable member, I forget which, Mr. Bone, you have to excuse me, asked how many prisons still have detached duty. The answer is 15. It's not something we want to do on a longer term. It's disruptive for the lives of prison officers. It costs us more money. But I will say, I will talk about the success we've had in recruiting more prison officers, which we are continuing to do on a very active basis in the course of my remarks. So I'd like to... Honourable Gentleman, just let me make a little bit of progress in my speech, because I'm just conscious I've only got 6 minutes left. So I'd like to start by paying tribute to the many people who work tirelessly in our prisons: prison officers, probation staff, staff from the health, education, vocational skills and voluntary sectors work day in, day out to transform and improve the lives of people in custody. And each time we are successful in preventing an offender from reoffending, we're also reducing the number of victims and making our communities safer. This is difficult work, and it goes largely unseen and too often unrecognised in our public discourse, but it's vital and it is making a difference. The challenges of maintaining safety in prisons are and always have been significant. We're working with a challenging and complex population in excess of 85,000 prisoners with a high prevalence of mental health problems, as already has been raised. Many have negative life events that we know increase the likelihood of them harming themselves or taking their own lives. And we're also holding, and this is an important point, we're holding a more violent prisoner population. The number of people sentenced to prison for violent offences has increased by 40% in the last 10 years. In addition, the illicit use of new psychoactive substances, the lethal highs, such as spice and black mamba and so on, has been a significant factor in fueling violence in prisons. Last year alone, staff responded to nearly 26,000 self-harm incidents and frequently prevent deaths from timely intervention. They continue to support over 2,000 prisoners assessed as being at risk on any given day and look after them under the assessment, caring, custody and teamwork process. It's to their credit that through their dedication and commitment, they continue to improve outcomes for offenders and also prevent many self-inflicted deaths and incidents of self-harm. Staff and prisoners should no more face violence than any other person in society. Violence in prisons is wholly unacceptable. We treat any assault extremely seriously. Any prisoner who commits an act of violence can expect to have action taken against him, which may include a loss of privileges or sanctions under the prison disciplinary procedures, and where appropriate, facing criminal charges and prosecution. And to this end, and this was a new venture that the last government brought in, a joint national protocol between the National Offender Management Service, the Crown Prosecution Service, and the National Police Chiefs Council was published in February to ensure that referral of and the prosecution of crimes in prisons are dealt with consistently. The protocol sets out the requirement for prisons to submit a prison community impact assessment, with each case referred to the police, and this will explain the impact the offence has on the establishment and make sure this is properly understood and taken into account in the cases concerned. In 2014, due to an unexpected increase in staff turnover and an unforeseen increase in the prison population, there were delays in bringing the levels of staff up to the numbers required. However, we have exceeded our target of recruiting 1,700 new entry prison officers by March 2015, and we're continuing to recruit officers and operational support grades across the country. And we'll focus our efforts in particular on London, on the South East, where there is further need. Now, violence is an issue I take personally extremely seriously. There have been increases which have already been referred to. The National Offender Management Service has established a violence reduction project. In particular, there's a current pilot of body-worn video cameras across 24 establishments, and I'm taking a very keen interest in the development of that. There are 2 new offences that have been introduced for the Serious Crimes Act 2015, being in possession of a knife or other offensive weapon within a prison, and throwing items of spice or anything else dangerous, mobile phones, over a prison wall without authorisation. Both of those will attract prison sentences. Action is being taken on new psychoactive substances. In particular, we need a test for it, and we are working very hard to bring that about. I just want to reassure members that safety is absolutely fundamental to the rehabilitative work. One of the reasons I care so much about it. Without the safety, we can't do the education and the work. I now need to give way, I think, to the member who introduced the debate.
Rachael Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Bowen, and may I thank all the honourable members for their contributions in today's debate, raising many of the challenges facing our penal system today. As we've heard, there are unacceptable levels of reoffending, yet we haven't had the real answers of how we're going to turn those figures around. They've been static, but they're not progressing, and they're not coming down. And we've heard so many shocking statistics about the levels of violence and abuse in our prisons, and yet still I haven't had the answers of how we're going to address that. We have really heard the evidence today of how overcrowding mixed with understaffing is the real issue facing our prisons, and I'm sure that no prison officer has had comfort from the Minister's response today in the fact that they are still going to be at risk when they turn up for work today, tomorrow and the next day. And that was the subject of this debate, and I am really saddened that we haven't progressed that issue, and it is so vital that we get the response that we need, which is about stable staffing and making sure that staff are safe, but also that our communities are safe in the future too.
Order. As the honourable member was speaking at 11 o'clock, we don't get to divide on the issue now. We move to the next debate.